When I think about how it all began, I wish I could point to some singular moment that would explain it. A flash of weakness, a misunderstanding, anything that could make sense of what I did. But the truth is messier than that. My name is Kate, and for 10 years, I had what most people would call a happy marriage. My husband, Brian, was steady and kind, and we had an 8-year-old son, Owen, who was the center of our world. Life was good, or at least, it seemed that way on the surface. It all started on a crisp autumn morning when I walked into the principal's office for a routine parent-teacher meeting. Owen's teacher had mentioned some concerns about his focus in class, and while I wasn't overly worried, I wanted to stay ahead of any potential issues. The school principal, Mr. Harris, greeted me with a warm smile as I entered his office. He was in his early 40s, tall and polished, with an easy confidence that put people at ease. "Mrs. Taylor," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming in. Please, have a seat." I remember noticing how his office felt different from the rest of the school, more sophisticated, with dark wood furniture and framed certificates lining the walls. It felt like stepping into another world, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I found myself a little nervous. We talked about Owen's progress, his strengths and weaknesses, and Mr. Harris offered thoughtful advice on how to support him at home. His attentiveness was disarming, and I found myself opening up more than I'd intended, about the challenges of balancing work, parenting, and marriage. "You're doing an incredible job," he said, his voice sincere. "It's clear how much you care about Owen." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth rise in my cheeks. "Thank you," I said, smiling. "That means a lot." The meeting ended without incident, but as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Mr. Harris's words, his presence, they lingered in my mind long after I'd left the school. Over the weeks that followed, I saw him at various school events, always professional, always composed, but there was a subtle connection that I couldn't ignore. A glance that lingered a second too long, a smile that felt a little too personal. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but the thrill it gave me was undeniable. Then, one day, I received an email from Mr. Harris. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just a follow-up about Owen's progress, but his tone was warm, and he ended the message with a line that stood out: "If you ever want to discuss this further, my door is always open." I knew it was harmless, but I found myself rereading the email, searching for subtext where there likely was none. Against my better judgment, I replied, thanking him for his support and mentioning how much Owen enjoyed school this year. What followed was a series of exchanges, innocent at first, but gradually becoming more personal. We talked about everything from books and movies to the challenges of parenting. He had a way of making me feel seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years. At home, things with Brian were fine. That was the problem. Our conversations revolved around schedules and chores, and while there was no animosity between us, there was also no spark. I told myself that what was happening with Mr. Harris was just a harmless connection, a small escape from the monotony of everyday life. But then came the night of the school's annual fundraiser. Brian couldn't attend because of work, so I went alone, dressed in a simple black dress that I hoped was appropriate but not overly formal. When I arrived, the room was buzzing with activity, parents chatting, teachers mingling, and a band playing softly in the corner. I spotted Mr. Harris almost immediately. He was wearing a tailored suit that made him look even more polished than usual, and when his eyes met mine across the room, I felt my heart skip a beat. "Mrs. Taylor," he said when we finally crossed paths, his smile warm and genuine. "You look lovely tonight." "Thank you," I said, feeling a blush rise in my cheeks. "It's a great event." We chatted briefly about the fundraiser, the school's goals, and Owen's enthusiasm for his new art class. But there was an undercurrent to our conversation, a tension that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. As the night wore on, I found myself gravitating toward him, drawn by a connection I couldn't explain. And when the event ended, and most of the guests had left, he offered to walk me to my car. The parking lot was quiet, the night air crisp and filled with the scent of fallen leaves. As we reached my car, I turned to thank him, but before I could speak, he stepped closer. "Kate," he said softly, his voice low and steady. My heart raced as I met his gaze, the world around us fading into the background. "Yes," I whispered. For a moment, we stood there, the space between us charged with unspoken emotions. And then, without warning, he kissed me. It was brief, almost tentative, but it left me breathless. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, stepping back. "I shouldn't have." "It's okay," I interrupted, though my voice trembled. I didn't finish the sentence. Instead, I got into my car and drove away, my mind spinning with a mix of guilt, excitement, and confusion. I knew I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. That night, as I lay in bed beside Brian, the kiss replayed in my mind over and over again. I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, teetering dangerously close to a fall I couldn't stop. Brian slept soundly next to me, his breathing even and calm, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I wanted to tell myself it was just a moment of weakness, a mistake that wouldn't happen again, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Mr. Harris. My heart pounded as I opened it, half expecting an apology or a plea to forget what had happened. But his words were measured, careful. "Kate, I'm sorry for crossing a line last night. I don't want to make things complicated for you or for me. If you want to put this behind us, I completely understand." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. His words were exactly what I should have wanted, a way out, a chance to pretend nothing had happened. But instead of relief, I felt an ache, a pull I couldn't explain. Before I could stop myself, I typed a response: "There's nothing to apologize for. I don't regret it, but I think we need to be careful." The moment I hit send, a wave of guilt crashed over me. What was I doing? Why couldn't I just walk away? But part of me already knew the answer. Over the next few weeks, my life became a delicate balancing act. At home, I did my best to maintain the facade of a loving wife and mother. I cooked dinners, helped Owen with his homework, and tried to engage Brian in conversation, though our interactions felt increasingly hollow. He noticed the change in me, I could tell, but he chalked it up to stress. "You've been working too hard," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. "Why don't you take a day for yourself?" I nodded, offering a small smile, but inside, I felt like a fraud. At school, things with Mr. Harris were different. We kept our interactions professional in public, careful not to draw attention, but behind closed doors, our connection deepened. We started meeting in his office after hours, under the guise of discussing Owen's progress or school matters. At first, our conversations were just that, harmless, if overly personal. But it didn't take long for the lines to blur. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, I lingered in his office as the sun set outside. "I don't know why I keep coming here," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe because you feel the same way I do," he said, his gaze steady. I looked at him, the weight of his words settling over me. "And what weight is that?" "Like I've found something I didn't know I was missing," he said, his voice soft but certain. The words hung between us, unspoken but understood. Before I knew it, he was standing in front of me, his hand brushing against mine. "You can walk away, Kate," he said quietly. "But if you don't want to." I didn't walk away. What followed was a whirlwind of stolen moments and shared secrets, a hidden world that felt exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Every time I saw him, every time he smiled at me or touched my hand, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. But with that thrill came an undercurrent of guilt that grew harder to ignore. At home, the cracks in my marriage became more pronounced. Brian tried to reach out to me, his patience thinning as my distance became impossible to hide. "Kate," he said one night as we sat at the dinner table, Owen chattering happily between us, "are you okay?" You've been different lately. I'm fine, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Just tired. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he studied me as though trying to solve a puzzle. One afternoon, as I was leaving the school after another meeting with Mr. Harris, I ran into another mom, Karen, in the parking lot. She was cheerful and chatty as always, but her gaze lingered on me a little too long. You've been spending a lot of time here, she said casually, her tone light but curious. Just trying to stay involved, I said, keeping my voice even. Karen smiled, but there was something behind her eyes that made my stomach twist. That's great, she said. Not everyone takes such an interest in their kid's school life. I nodded, offering a polite goodbye before hurrying to my car. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something, or suspected it. That evening, as I lay awake in bed, the weight of my choices pressed down on me. I was living a double life, and the walls were closing in. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever, but the thought of walking away from Mr. Harris felt unbearable. And yet, the thought of losing everything I had built with Brian and Owen was even worse. Each passing day felt like I was walking a razor's edge, the boundaries between my two lives growing increasingly blurry. At home, I tried to be the wife and mother Brian and Owen deserved, but my mind was always somewhere else, trapped in the stolen moments with Mr. Harris, reliving the intensity of his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. Brian wasn't oblivious. He'd always been perceptive, and while he hadn't confronted me outright, I could feel his eyes on me more often, his questions slightly sharper than before. Did something happen at school? He asked one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. What do you mean? I replied, keeping my tone light. I don't know, he said, shrugging. You've been distracted lately, and you've been spending a lot of time there. I forced a laugh, hoping it didn't sound as strained as it felt. Just trying to stay on top of things for Owen, I said. Brian didn't press further, but the weight of his doubt lingered between us. At school, things with Mr. Harris grew more intense. Our meetings became more frequent, and our conversations more intimate. He was always careful, always professional in public, but the moment we were alone, the carefully maintained facade crumbled. One afternoon, as I stood in his office, the blinds drawn and the door locked, he reached for my hand. Kate, he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet urgency, this can't stay like this forever. What do you mean? I asked, my heart racing. I mean, I don't want to keep hiding, he admitted, his gaze steady. I want more than stolen moments and whispered conversations. His words sent a jolt through me, equal parts thrilling and terrifying. I don't know if I can give you that, I said, my voice trembling. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I understand, he said quietly. But I need you to be honest with yourself, and with me. That night, as I lay awake in bed, his words echoed in my mind. I had thought I could keep everything compartmentalized, that I could have this secret life without it spilling into the rest of my world. But I was beginning to realize how naive that was. The next day, Karen, the nosy mom I had run into before, approached me after drop-off. Kate, she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp, I've been meaning to ask, are you and Mr. Harris working on something special for the school? Her question caught me off guard, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. Not really, I said, forcing a laugh. Just the usual parent-teacher stuff. Karen smiled, but there was a knowing glint in her eyes. Well, you're certainly dedicated, she said. As she walked away, my stomach churned with unease. Was she just making conversation, or did she know more than she let on? The paranoia was suffocating, and I found myself jumping at every shadow, every sideways glance from another parent. At home, the tension with Brian continued to build. He started coming home earlier, offering to pick up Owen from school or take over bedtime routines, small gestures that felt like an attempt to close the growing distance between us. But instead of feeling comforted, I felt cornered. One evening, as we sat on the couch after putting Owen to bed, Brian turned to me, his expression serious. "Kate," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I need to ask you something." My heart pounded as I nodded. "What is it?" "Are you happy?" he asked, his gaze piercing. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Of course I am," I said finally, though the words felt hollow. He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Okay," he said, though I could tell he didn't believe me. That night, as I lay beside him, the weight of my choices pressed down on me like never before. I had thought I could keep this hidden, that I could balance the thrill of my affair with the stability of my marriage. But I was beginning to see how impossible that was. Something had to give. The morning after Brian's question, I woke up with a sinking feeling in my chest. His words, "Are you happy?" reverberated in my mind, forcing me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't happy, not in the way he thought. My life had become a series of lies and half-truths, a juggling act that was bound to come crashing down sooner or later. At breakfast, Brian was quieter than usual, sipping his coffee as Owen rattled on about an upcoming field trip. I caught him watching me a few times, his expression unreadable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for me to say something, to admit what I'd done. But I didn't. At school, things with Mr. Harris were beginning to fray at the edges. The intensity that had once drawn me to him now felt suffocating, his glances and touches heavy with expectation. I knew he wanted more from me, but I didn't know how to give it to him, or if I even wanted to. One afternoon, as I dropped off a permission slip for Owen's field trip, Mr. Harris caught me in the hallway. "Kate," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "Can we talk?" "Not now," I said quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "We can't keep avoiding this," he said, his voice low. "You know that, right?" I didn't respond. Instead, I walked away, my heart pounding as I hurried to my car. That evening, as I was helping Owen with his homework, my phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Harris, "We need to figure this out. I can't keep doing this." I stared at the screen, the weight of his words settling over me. He was right, this couldn't go on. But I didn't know how to end it without unraveling everything. The tension at home was unbearable. Brian was distant but watchful, his questions growing more pointed with each passing day. "You've been on edge lately," he said one night as we cleaned up after dinner. "I'm fine," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't press further, but his silence spoke volumes. The breaking point came a week later at a school event. It was Owen's class performance, and the auditorium was packed with parents and teachers. Brian had taken the evening off to attend, and we sat together in the front row, clapping and cheering as Owen and his classmates performed a spirited rendition of The Jungle Book. After the performance, as parents mingled and took pictures, I saw Mr. Harris across the room. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt my stomach twist. I turned away quickly, but not before Brian caught the exchange. "Who's that?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. "Just the principal," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Brian didn't respond, but I could feel his eyes on me, studying me with a scrutiny that made my skin crawl. The next day, Karen cornered me in the parking lot. "Kate," she said, her tone light but her eyes cold, "you and Mr. Harris seem to be getting pretty close." I froze, my mind racing for a response. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, forcing a laugh. She raised an eyebrow, her smile thin. "Just an observation," she said before walking away. The paranoia that followed was unbearable. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, analyzing every interaction for signs that someone had noticed the tension between me and Mr. Harris. I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. At home, Brian's patience was wearing thin. One evening, as we sat together after putting Owen to bed, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Kate," he said, his voice steady but firm, is there something you're not telling me? My heart pounded as I forced myself to meet his gaze. No, I said, the lie catching in my throat. His jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly. Okay, he said quietly. If that's what you want me to believe. The weight of his words lingered long after he left the room, a reminder that the walls I'd built to protect myself were closing in. That night, as I lay awake in the darkness, I realized that I couldn't keep living this way. Something had to change. The morning after Brian's quiet accusation, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. The weight of his words, if that's what you want me to believe, hung heavy in the air. He didn't press further, but the unspoken tension between us was palpable. Every glance he gave me felt like a challenge, a silent plea for the truth I couldn't bring myself to admit. At breakfast, Owen chattered happily about his upcoming field trip, oblivious to the strain between his parents. Brian smiled at him, his warmth genuine, but when his eyes flicked to me, they were colder than I'd ever seen. I can pick Owen up after the trip, Brian said casually, breaking the silence. That's fine, I replied, avoiding his gaze. The rest of the morning passed in a blur, but as soon as I dropped Owen off at school, my phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Harris, "Can we talk?" "This can't wait." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. I knew I should ignore it, but the pull was too strong. Against my better judgment, I replied, "After school." "Your office." The day dragged on as I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting to the impending conversation. By the time I arrived at the school, my nerves were shot. I made my way to Mr. Harris's office, the hallways eerily quiet in the late afternoon. When I stepped inside, he was waiting for me, his expression tense. "Kate," he began, standing as I closed the door. "We can't keep doing this." "I know," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "But I don't know how to fix it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't sustainable, for either of us. You're not happy, and he trailed off, his eyes meeting mine. "I care about you, but this is too much." His words cut deeper than I expected, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "So, what are you saying?" I asked finally. "I'm saying we need to stop before this destroys us both," he said, his voice firm. The finality of his words hit me like a punch to the chest, but I knew he was right. As much as it hurt, continuing this charade would only lead to more pain. "I understand," I said quietly, tears welling in my eyes. "Do you?" he asked, his tone softening. "Because if we keep going, it's only a matter of time before someone finds out. And I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart." His concern was genuine, and it made the decision even harder. But I nodded, forcing myself to accept the inevitable. "You're right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The drive home felt like a blur, my mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. When I walked through the door, Brian was waiting in the kitchen, his arms crossed. "You're late," he said, his tone sharp. "There was traffic," I lied, my voice unsteady. He studied me for a long moment before shaking his head. "You're a terrible liar, Kate." My heart stopped, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you've been acting strange for months," he said, his voice rising. "I'm talking about the way you avoid me, the way you light up when you're at the school. I'm not blind, Kate. Something's going on, and I want the truth." His words felt like a hammer, each one breaking down the fragile walls I'd built around myself. "Brian, I trailed off, unable to find the words. "Just tell me the truth," he said, his voice breaking. "I deserve that much." Tears streamed down my face as I looked at him, the weight of my guilt crushing me. "I made a mistake," I admitted, my voice trembling. "A terrible mistake." Brian's expression shifted from anger to disbelief, and he took a step back. "With who?" "The principal," I said, the words feeling like poison on my tongue. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his face pale and his jaw clenched. "How long?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not long," I said quickly. "It's over, Brian. I ended it." "Do you think that makes it better?" he asked, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I know," I sobbed. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But I want to fix this. I want to fix us." Brian shook his head, his expression filled with a mix of anger and pain. "I don't know if we can come back from this," he said quietly. He left the room, leaving me alone with the weight of my confession and the reality of what I had done. The days following my confession were some of the hardest of my life. Brian didn't speak to me unless it was absolutely necessary, his silence more cutting than any argument could have been. We moved through the house like strangers, only interacting when it came to Owen. Owen, thankfully, seemed unaware of the tension. He was full of excitement about his field trip and upcoming soccer games, his laughter a stark contrast to the cold silence between Brian and me. I clung to those moments with him, trying to remind myself of the good still left in my life, but the guilt was unrelenting. Brian, for his part, had retreated into himself. He spent hours in the garage or went on long drives, coming home late with nothing more than a curt nod in my direction. When he was home, he avoided me entirely, leaving me to sit alone in the evenings, replaying every mistake I'd made. One evening, after Owen had gone to bed, I found Brian in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of whiskey in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot, and his expression was one of exhaustion and hurt. "Brian," I began, my voice trembling. "We need to talk." He didn't look at me, swirling the liquid in his glass. "Talk about what, Kate?" "About how you threw everything we had away." His words hit me like a punch, and I struggled to hold back tears. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I know I've hurt you, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. But we can't keep living like this." He let out a bitter laugh, finally meeting my gaze. "You think an apology fixes this? You think saying you're sorry makes up for the fact that you betrayed me?" "No," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try to fix this. For us. For Owen." Brian shook his head, setting his glass down on the counter. "I don't know if that's possible," he said quietly. "I don't even know who you are anymore." His words cut deeper than I expected, and I found myself at a loss. "Please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Give me a chance to prove to you that I can be better." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice cold. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was more than I deserved. The next day, I threw myself into trying to salvage what was left of our marriage. I started seeing a therapist, determined to understand how I had allowed things to spiral so far out of control. My therapist, a kind but firm woman named Lydia, didn't let me off the hook. "You need to take full accountability," she said during our first session. "Not just for what you did, but for the reasons behind it." Her words stayed with me, and I began to unravel the years of resentment, dissatisfaction, and loneliness that had led me to make the choices I had. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Brian, meanwhile, remained distant. He agreed to attend a few counseling sessions with me, though his reluctance was clear. During our first session, he was brutally honest about his feelings. "I feel betrayed," he said, his voice steady but filled with pain. "I feel like everything I thought I knew about our marriage was a lie." "I understand," I said, tears streaming down my face. "And I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust." Our counselor, a soft-spoken man named Peter, encouraged us to focus on small steps, finding moments of connection amidst the pain. It was easier said than done, but I tried. At home, Brian and I began sharing small conversations, about Owen, about work, about mundane things that didn't carry the weight of our broken relationship. They weren't deep or meaningful, but they were a start. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching Owen play in the yard, Brian turned to me. "Do you really think we can fix this?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I want to try." "Don't you?" He was quiet for a long moment before nodding. "For Owen's sake, I'm willing to try. But it's going to take time, Kate. A lot of time." "I know," I said softly. It wasn't a resolution, but it was something. The days after Brian agreed to try felt like walking on thin ice. Every interaction was careful, deliberate, as though one wrong word could send us crashing through the surface. We spoke more than we had in weeks, but the conversations were stilted, filled with silences that neither of us knew how to fill. Owen, blissfully unaware of the tension that lingered between his parents, continued to be our anchor. His excitement about school projects and soccer games gave us something neutral to focus on, a temporary reprieve from the weight of our broken marriage. One Saturday morning, as Owen was gearing up for a soccer game, Brian turned to me. "Are you coming?" he asked, his tone neutral. "I'd like to," I said cautiously, unsure of whether he really wanted me there. "Good," he said simply, grabbing Owen's bag and heading out the door. At the game, we stood side by side on the sidelines, cheering for Owen as he darted across the field. It felt almost normal, a brief return to the partnership we'd once had. But when the game ended, and we found ourselves alone in the car as Owen chatted with friends, the silence returned. "Thanks for coming," Brian said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. "Of course," I said, glancing at him. "I'm trying, Brian. I really am." He didn't respond, but the slight nod he gave me felt like a small step forward. Counseling sessions became a routine, though they were far from easy. Brian's pain was raw and unfiltered, and he didn't hold back. "I don't know how to look at her and not see the betrayal," he admitted during one session, his voice trembling with emotion. "I know," I said, my voice thick with tears. "And I don't expect you to forget. But I want to prove to you that I'm still the person you fell in love with." Our counselor, Peter, encouraged us to focus on rebuilding trust through actions rather than words. "Trust isn't restored overnight," he said. "It's earned through consistency and vulnerability." I took his advice to heart, trying to show Brian through small gestures that I was committed to making things right. I left my phone unlocked and in plain sight, answered every question he asked honestly, and made a conscious effort to be present and engaged at home. Brian, for his part, began to open up as well. One evening, as we sat on the porch after putting Owen to bed, he turned to me. "Do you know why this hurts so much?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Because I broke your trust," I said softly. He shook his head. "It's more than that. I thought we were a team, Kate. I thought we could face anything together. And now? I don't know if I'll ever feel that way again." His words broke my heart, but they also gave me insight into the depth of his pain. "I want to be a team again," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn that back." The journey toward healing wasn't linear. There were good days when we laughed together over something Owen said or shared a quiet moment that felt almost like old times. But there were also bad days when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull us back into silence and resentment. One evening, after a particularly tense counseling session, Brian surprised me by suggesting a date night. "I think we need to remember what it's like to just be us," he said, his tone hesitant. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what to expect. That Saturday, we went to a small Italian restaurant we used to frequent before Owen was born. The atmosphere was warm and familiar, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we talked without the shadow of the past hanging over us. "I missed this," Brian admitted as we shared a plate of tiramisu. "Me too," I said, my heart swelling with hope. The evening felt like a turning point, a reminder of what we were fighting for. But I knew there was still a long road ahead. The true test came a few weeks later when Karen, the nosy mom who had been hovering on the edges of my life, approached me at a school event. "Kate," she said, her tone sweet but laced with curiosity, "how's everything going at home?" "Fine," I said evenly, refusing to let her rattle me. "I heard Mr. Harris might be leaving the school soon," she said, her eyes sharp. "Do you know anything about that?" My stomach churned, but I kept my expression neutral. "No, I hadn't heard," I said, forcing a polite smile. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment before she shrugged. "Just thought you might know, since you've been so involved this year." The encounter left me shaken, but I reminded myself that the only thing that mattered was my family. I had already lost so much, I couldn't afford to let Karen or anyone else disrupt the fragile progress Brian and I were making. That night, as we sat together in the living room, I told Brian about the conversation. "I think Karen suspects something," I said, my voice trembling. Brian was quiet for a moment before nodding. "Then we stick to the truth," he said firmly. "We focus on us and let everything else fall away." His words gave me a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like we were facing it together. The weeks that followed felt like a cautious balancing act, each day a test of whether the fragile progress Brian and I had made could withstand the weight of our past. There were moments when it felt like we were finding our way back to each other, like when we laughed together at Owen's antics or shared a quiet evening on the porch. But there were also moments when the hurt lingered, heavy and unspoken, threatening to pull us back into the silence that had defined the worst of our days. One afternoon, as I watched Brian play catch with Owen in the yard, I felt a pang of guilt and gratitude all at once. He hadn't had to stay. He could have walked away and left me to face the consequences of my choices alone. But he had chosen to try, and that choice meant everything. Counseling continued to be a cornerstone of our progress. Peter pushed us to explore not just the pain of the affair but also the deeper cracks that had formed in our relationship long before it began. "You both need to understand how you got here," he said during one session. "Not just the betrayal, but the distance that allowed it to happen. It was a painful process, forcing us to confront the ways we had failed each other over the years." Brian admitted that his long hours at work had left me feeling isolated, while I acknowledged that I hadn't communicated my struggles, choosing instead to seek validation elsewhere. "I should have seen how unhappy you were," Brian said one evening as we sat together on the couch. "And I should have told you," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. The honesty between us was both painful and healing, each conversation a step toward understanding. As time went on, the shadows of the affair began to fade, though they never disappeared entirely. Karen's presence at school events became less of a looming threat as I distanced myself from the PTA drama and focused solely on Owen. Mr. Harris, true to Karen's prediction, announced his resignation, citing a desire to pursue new opportunities. His departure was a quiet one, with little fanfare, and while it brought a sense of closure, it also left me with a bittersweet ache. The real turning point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Owen had invited a few friends over for a playdate, and the house was filled with the sound of laughter and the occasional crash of toys. Brian and I worked together to wrangle the chaos, our movements synchronized in a way that felt both familiar and new. As we cleaned up the aftermath, Brian turned to me, a small smile playing on his lips. "You know," he said, "I think we're starting to figure this out." I smiled back, tears welling in my eyes. "I think so too." That evening, after Owen was in bed, Brian and I sat on the porch, watching the rain fall. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he said, his voice steady. "And?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I'm still hurt," he admitted. "I probably will be for a long time. But I'm starting to believe that we can come out of this stronger than we were before." His words brought a wave of relief and gratitude, and I reached for his hand. "Thank you," I said softly. "For giving us a chance." He nodded, his grip on my hand firm. "You're worth it," he said simply. In the months that followed, we continued to rebuild, piece by piece. There were setbacks, moments when the scars of the past threatened to reopen, but there were also triumphs, small victories that reminded us of why we had chosen to fight for each other. Through it all, Owen remained our anchor, his laughter and joy a constant reminder of what we were working to protect. And as I watched him grow, I realized that our journey wasn't just about fixing what had been broken, it was about building something new, something stronger. In the end, our story wasn't one of perfection or easy answers. It was a story of pain and redemption, of mistakes and forgiveness. It was a story of two people who chose to stay, even when leaving might have been easier. And for that, I was grateful,